The wine stain spread across the white tablecloth like blood at exactly 10:34 p.m. during the private dinner party at Romanoff's in Beverly Hills, and the young waitress whose hand had slipped, whose tray had tilted just enough that the $400 bottle of 1947 Shade Al Margox had toppled and spilled across the table where Frank Sinatra sat with three studio executives, their wives, and a director whose new film was supposed to save MGM from bankruptcy, stood frozen with the empty bottle still in her hand, watching the dark red liquid seep into the fabric and drip onto the floor. And in that terrible suspended moment, before anyone spoke, before anyone moved, she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to change in a way that couldn't be undone. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 19 years old, had been working at Romanoff's for exactly 3 weeks after her previous job at a diner in East LA had closed down. And this job, this impossible, terrifying, prestigious job serving movie stars and executives in the most exclusive restaurant in Los Angeles, was supposed to be her way out, her chance to make enough money to help her mother pay the medical bills that had been piling up since her father died 6 months ago. And now she just spilled $400 worth of wine on Frank Sinatra's table, and she could see her future collapsing in real time. The table went silent. One of the executives' wives gasped. The director stopped mid-sentence. And Frank Sinatra looked down at his suit, custom-made, probably worth more than Elena made in 3 months, where a splash of wine had landed on the sleeve. And then he looked up at Elena with those blue eyes that she'd seen in a dozen movies. And she waited for the explosion, for the anger, for the moment when he'd demand to see the manager and she'd be fired and blacklisted, and her mother would lose the house because Elena couldn't make the payments. But Sinatra didn't explode. He looked at the wine on his sleeve, then at the stain spreading across the tablecloth, then back at Elena, and his face showed something she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not even annoyance, just assessment, like he was calculating something, working through a problem that only he could see. "Everyone okay?" Sinatra asked, looking around the table. Nobody got burned or cut. The executives shook their heads. Their wives murmured that they were fine. The director brushed some wine droplets off his jacket. "Just wine," one of the executives said. "Could have been worse." Sinatra stood up, pulled out his handkerchief, and started dabbing at the stain on his sleeve. "Elena," he said quietly, and she flinched at hearing her own name because she hadn't realized he'd been paying attention when she'd introduced herself at the start of the evening, hadn't thought someone like Frank Sinatra would bother remembering the name of a waitress. "Yes, Mr. Sinatra." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're new here, right? 3 weeks. You like it?" She didn't know how to answer that. Yes, sir." "Good, because you're about to learn something important." He looked at the table, at the executives and their wives and the director, and his voice changed, not louder but different, carrying a weight that made everyone lean in slightly. "I knocked the bottle over," Sinatra said. Elena blinked. "Sir." "The bottle. I knocked it over with my elbow, wasn't paying attention, was gesturing while I was talking and caught it with my arm. My fault." "But," Elena started, and Sinatra's eyes cut to her, sharp and clear, and she understood immediately that she was supposed to stop talking. "My fault," Sinatra repeated, looking at the table. "I'm sorry about the mess. Elena was just trying to refill our glasses and I knocked the bottle out of her hand." He turned to her. "Elena, can you get us another bottle? Same vintage if you have it. If not, whatever's close. And put it on my tab." "Mr. Sinatra, you don't have to. I knocked it over. I'm paying for it. That's how it works." He sat back down, and the conversation at the table resumed like nothing had happened. Like $400 worth of wine hadn't just been destroyed. Like Frank Sinatra hadn't just lied to protect a waitress. He barely knew from consequences that would have ended her career before it started. Elena walked back to the service station on legs that felt disconnected from her body, found the sommelier, ordered another bottle with hands that were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together, and waited while he pulled the wine from the cellar and decanted it. And the whole time she kept replaying what had just happened, kept trying to understand why Frank Sinatra had lied for her, had claimed responsibility for something she'd done, had protected her from something he had no obligation to protect her from. She brought the new bottle to the table 15 minutes later, poured it with extreme care, so much care that her hands steadied from the sheer concentration required to not spill a single drop. And when she filled Sinatra's glass, he looked up at her and said, "Thank you, Elena," with the same courtesy he'd use with anyone, like she hadn't just cost him $400, like he hadn't just saved her job, like nothing remarkable had happened at all. The dinner continued for another hour. Elena served the rest of the meal without incident, brought dessert and coffee and digestifs. And when the party finally ended at midnight and they all stood to leave, Sinatra pulled out his wallet and laid down a stack of bills that included a tip 3 times larger than standard. And as he put on his coat and walked toward the exit with the rest of his group, he caught Elena's eye for just a second and gave her a single nod. Not a smile, not a wink. Just acknowledgement that something had passed between them, something understood. After they left, the restaurant manager, a man named Gregory who'd been running Romanoff's for 8 years and had seen everything, had dealt with every kind of celebrity behavior from generous to monstrous, called Elena into his office. She walked in expecting to be fired anyway, expecting that somehow the truth had come out, that someone had seen what really happened and reported it, but Gregory just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mr. Sinatra spoke to me before he left," Gregory said. "Oh." Elena's heart was pounding. "He wanted to make sure you weren't disciplined for the wine incident. Said it was entirely his fault. Said you handled it with grace and professionalism." Yes, sir." Gregory studied her. "Elena, I've been in this business a long time, and I've seen a lot of waitstaff make mistakes, some small, some large. And I've seen how celebrities react to those mistakes. Most of them make a scene. Some of them get people fired for sport. But I've never, and I mean never, seen someone like Frank Sinatra claim responsibility for something that clearly wasn't his fault." Elena didn't know what to say. "You spilled that wine, didn't you?" Gregory asked quietly. She could have lied, could have stuck to Sinatra's story, but something about the way Gregory was looking at her made dishonesty feel impossible. "Yes, sir." "Why did he cover for you?" "I don't know." Gregory leaned back in his chair. "Well, whatever the reason, you're very lucky. And you should understand something, Frank Sinatra doesn't do things like that casually. He doesn't protect people randomly, which means he saw something in you, something worth protecting. Don't waste it." "I won't, sir." "Good, now go home. You've had a long night." Elena left Romanoff's at 12:47 a.m. and took the bus back to East LA, and the whole ride she thought about what had happened, about why someone like Frank Sinatra would lie to protect someone like her, and she couldn't come up with an answer that made sense. Couldn't understand what he'd seen in that moment that made him decide she was worth $400, and the effort of fabricating a story that no one at that table believed but everyone accepted because, when Frank Sinatra says something happened a certain way, you don't contradict him. 3 days later, Elena arrived at work to find an envelope waiting for her at the hostess stand. Her name was written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a note on plain stationery that said, "Your mother's medical bills. Consider them paid. You don't owe me anything except this. The next time you see someone make a mistake, remember that everyone deserves a second chance." FS Elena stared at the check for a full minute. $2,000, enough to pay off 3 months of her mother's hospital debt, enough to keep the house, enough to buy time. She went to Gregory's office, showed him the note. "Did you tell him?" she asked. "Tell him what?" "About my mother, about why I need this job." Gregory shook his head. "I didn't tell him anything." "Then how did he know?" "I don't know, but Frank Sinatra knows things. He pays attention, he sees people, and when he decides to help, he helps." Elena worked at Romanoff's for another 4 years. She never spilled another glass of wine, never made another mistake that cost the restaurant money. And she never saw Frank Sinatra again. He stopped coming to Romanoff's about 6 months after that night, started going to other restaurants, other cities, and Elena sometimes wondered if he even remembered her, remembered the girl he'd protected for reasons she still didn't fully understand. but she remembered him. And she remembered what he'd written in that note. The next time you see someone make a mistake, remember that everyone deserves a second chance. She carried that with her when she eventually left Romanoff's and went to college, when she became a social worker and spent 30 years helping people who'd made mistakes, who needed second chances, who needed someone to believe they were worth protecting even when they'd screwed up. And whenever someone asked her why she did that kind of work, why she spent her life advocating for people who society had written off, she'd think about a night in 1962 when Frank Sinatra had looked at a 19-year-old waitress who just destroyed a $400 bottle of wine and decided she was worth lying for. Years after Sinatra died, a journalist tracked down Elena for a story about people whose lives had been changed by brief encounters with celebrities. "What was it like?" the journalist asked, meeting Frank Sinatra. "Brief," Elena said. "Did he say anything memorable?" "He told everyone at the table that he'd knocked over a bottle of wine that I'd actually spilled." "Why would he do that?" "Because he understood something that most people don't." "What's that?" "That mistakes don't define people. Intentions do. I made a mistake, but my intention wasn't to spill wine on his suit. My intention was to do my job well, and he saw that. And instead of punishing me for the mistake, he protected me because of the intention. And the money, the check he sent you." Elena smiled. "That wasn't charity, that was investment. He was investing in the idea that people who make mistakes deserve the chance to become people who don't." "Did it work?" "I spent 30 years as a social worker. I helped hundreds of people, people who'd made mistakes, people who needed someone to believe in them, so yeah, I'd say it worked." "Do you think he knew that his one action would have that kind of ripple effect?" "I think he hoped. I think that's why he did it, not because he knew what I'd become, but because he believed I could become something." The question is this. When you're Frank Sinatra and a 19-year-old waitress spills $400 worth of wine on your table, and you could let her face the consequences, or you could ignore it, or you could be gracious about it. But instead you lie. You claim you knocked the bottle over yourself. You pay for the replacement and leave a massive tip, and then secretly send her $2,000 for medical bills you somehow knew about. Is that kindness? Or is that understanding that power isn't about what you can take from people? It's about what you can give them when they need it most. And when that waitress spends 30 years helping other people because you helped her, when she builds a career on the principle that mistakes don't define people, when hundreds of lives are changed because you decided one mistake on one night didn't deserve to end one girl's future, did you save her? Or did you show everyone watching that the difference between cruelty and grace is just a choice? A split-second decision to protect someone who can't protect themselves. And maybe that's why the people at that table never contradicted your story about knocking over the wine. Not because they believed it, but because they understood that some lies are more truthful than the truth, and some acts of power are most powerful when they're used to make someone else feel powerless just a little bit less.